Halloween always had a way of bringing us back together, a blend of nostalgia and a reason to pretend we were still the carefree college kids we once were. In 2019, Alex invited us all to his house in the suburbs for what he promised would be a Halloween party no one would forget. He wasn't exaggerating. Alex, now the most successful among us, had a massive house, the kind with winding hallways and rooms you could get lost in. His house was always impressive, but on that night, it looked like something pulled from a nightmare. He'd spared no expense. Fake cobwebs hung from every corner, eerie lighting flickered in the windows, and skeletons seemed to leer from the shadows. The place was a haunted mansion come to life. I arrived a little after 9, the air cold with the bite of autumn. Inside, the warmth and the laughter from old friends wrapped around me, instantly easing any tension. It had been years since I'd seen most of them. There was Jules with her mischievous smile, already halfway into a glass of wine. Harlan, the loudest among us, regaled the group with a story about some embarrassing encounter from his work. And then there was Kavi, who still carried the quiet confidence that had made him so magnetic back in school. The conversation flowed easily, as if the years had been nothing but a long weekend. We shared drinks, reminisced about old times, and laughed harder than I had in years. Alex, dressed as a deranged ringmaster, was the life of the party, making sure everyone had a drink in hand and was having a good time. For a while, it felt like the past, as though time had slipped backward and we were once again just a bunch of friends enjoying each other's company without a care in the world. But then I noticed him. In the far corner of the room, standing apart from everyone else, was a man whose costume instantly sent a shiver down my spine. While the rest of us wore lighthearted costumes, pirates, witches, even a ridiculous inflatable dinosaur, this man was different. His mask looked disturbingly real, like a distorted human face with hollow, sunken eyes, pale, almost waxy skin, and a mouth that was twisted in a permanent grimace. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite describe, and the longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched, like a predator waiting for the right moment. I nudged Jules. "Who's that guy?" I whispered, nodding toward the man. She squinted, following my gaze. "No idea. Maybe one of Alex's new friends? He's been traveling a lot for work, meeting all sorts of people." "Yeah, but that mask," I muttered, feeling a tightness creep into my chest. Jules shrugged it off, taking another sip of her drink. "It's Halloween, right? People wear weird stuff." I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, but the longer I stayed, the harder it became. The man didn't mingle, didn't speak to anyone, just remained in that same spot, observing the room with those cold, empty eyes. Occasionally, I caught him staring at me, and each time, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake it. Alex noticed too. About an hour into the party, I saw him approach the man. He was smiling, the way Alex always did when he was trying to be polite, but was clearly uncomfortable. They exchanged a few words that I couldn't hear, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there motionless, watching Alex with those dead eyes. The tension in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, like a ripple that spread out slowly, infecting everyone. People started glancing in their direction, whispering, unsure of what was happening. That's when the man reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. The party came to a screeching halt. Laughter died mid-sentence, and the room plunged into a silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. No one moved. No one spoke. We were frozen in place, trapped in that moment of sheer disbelief. "Everyone stay quiet," the man's voice was a low rasp, muffled slightly by the mask but clear enough. "I don't want to hurt anyone." Panic flared in my chest, but my feet remained rooted to the spot. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the man waved the gun toward the group, ordering us to drop our phones, wallets, jewelry, anything of value onto the floor. Slowly, shakily, people began to comply, their faces drained of color. I felt like I was in a dream, like this couldn't possibly be happening. But it was. This wasn't some Halloween prank. As the pile of valuables grew on the floor, I noticed someone moving out of the corner of my eye. Megan, a quiet and unassuming friend, who had always been the calmest in any situation, was slowly edging her way toward the bathroom. The man's attention was on the group, and she slipped out of his line of sight without making a sound. My heart raced, praying that she wouldn't get caught. Somehow, miraculously, she disappeared into the hallway unnoticed. The man continued his demands, his voice low and calm, as though he'd done this 100 times before. I felt a knot forming in my throat. The door was right behind him, his escape route already planned. The air in the room was thick with fear, the kind that makes time stretch painfully slow. We all stood there, silent, helpless, as the man with the gun continued his demands. He never raised his voice, never threatened us beyond his calm orders. But somehow that made it worse. There was something chilling about how in control he seemed. Like he had done this before, like it was just another night for him. I glanced toward the hallway where Megan had disappeared. Had she made it? Was she calling the police? My mind swirled with questions, each one heavier than the last. My body was rigid, frozen between the urge to run and the terror of what might happen if I did. The man moved methodically, sweeping his eyes across the room, ensuring no one tried anything stupid. He bent down to pick up the pile of valuables we had left on the floor. Phones, wallets, jewelry. As he stuffed the items into a black duffel bag, I felt my heart pound harder, my thoughts growing more frantic. Surely someone had noticed something was wrong by now. Maybe the neighbors had heard something, or maybe Megan had gotten through to the police. It was the only hope I could cling to, a thread of salvation that I wasn't even sure existed. The man slung the bag over his shoulder, eyes still watching us from behind that grotesque mask. For a moment I thought it was over, that he would leave without any more violence. But as he backed toward the door, his gaze locked on me. My stomach turned to ice. Why me? I couldn't look away, couldn't even breathe. Something about his stare, those hollow, empty eyes, felt like they could see right through me. "Thanks for cooperating," he said, his voice so calm, almost polite. "Now don't move." He turned toward the door, his hand on the knob, and that's when I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. My heart leapt in my chest. Help was coming. Megan had done it, but the relief I felt was short-lived because the man heard it too. He paused, listening for a second, his hand tightening around the door handle. For a heartbeat, the room was still, everyone waiting, breath held, unsure of what would happen next. Then, without warning, he whipped around, pointing the gun directly at Alex, who was standing closest to him. "Who called them?" the man barked, his calm demeanor now fractured by panic. "Who called the cops?" No one spoke. I could see the fear in Alex's eyes, the slight tremble in his hands. My own pulse roared in my ears. This was the moment everything could spiral into chaos, and I prayed, silently, desperately, that no one would provoke him. The sirens grew louder, closer. There wasn't much time. The man glanced around the room, eyes darting from one person to the next, and for a split second, I thought he might start firing. My skin prickled with dread. Then, as if making a decision, he lowered the gun just slightly. He backed up toward the door, his gaze flickering between Alex and the rest of us. "You're lucky," he muttered, his voice shaking with the slightest tremor. "This time." He yanked the door open and bolted into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the quiet suburban street. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving us in a stunned, suffocating silence. For a moment, no one moved, no one even breathed. The adrenaline in my veins made me feel like I was vibrating, a strange mix of relief and lingering terror. Alex was the first to move, collapsing into a chair, his face pale and drawn. Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and unfocused, still processing the horror we had just survived. I could barely respond, nodding weakly. My throat was dry, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. One by one, the others started to stir, checking on each other, exchanging looks of disbelief. Megan reappeared from the hallway, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She looked as pale as the rest of us, but there was a determination in her eyes. "The police are almost here," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos we had just endured. "I told them everything." I let out a long, shaky breath. Megan had saved us. Without her, who knew how long the man would have stayed, what he might have done? The weight of the situation finally crashed down on me, and I felt weak, dizzy, the adrenaline beginning to fade. When the police arrived moments later, the flashing lights casting eerie patterns against the house's decorations. We gave our statements, our voices shaky and disjointed. They were efficient, asking questions and gathering details. But my mind was elsewhere, on that mask, those hollow eyes that still haunted me even though the man was gone. Days passed in a blur. I tried to go back to my normal life, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that distorted, grotesque face staring back at me. The man was caught eventually, part of a gang that had been targeting parties like ours for weeks, blending in and robbing guests when they least expected it. They arrested him, but the closure didn't come with it. He was gone, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. What stayed with me most wasn't the robbery itself. It wasn't even the gun or the stolen items. It was that mask, the way it seemed more than just a disguise, the way those sunken eyes had followed me around the room, even before the gun came out. Like he had chosen me for something more than just a robbery. Like I'd been marked by him in some way I still couldn't understand. Even now, whenever Halloween rolls around, I think about that night. I think about how a party meant to bring old friends together turned into something far darker. And I wonder if somewhere out there, he's still watching, still waiting.